let me know when you're ready. Oh, there we go. So my name is Allison Fiorello. I'm a researcher and faculty member at Children's National Medical Center, and then I have an affiliation with the George Washington University. I received my PhD in molecular biology from Northwestern, and then I came to do my my postdoctoral work with a person who was at Children's. His name was Eric Hoffman, and he cloned the first disease gene, which is called dystrophin. And so now what I do is I work on RNA specific therapeutics to restore this gene that's deficient in this genetic disorder. And so I know I do a lot of things that are also being done for COVID right now, like PCR, antigen testing, things like this. I understand the techniques. And yeah, I have a daughter who is in second grade at Eaton, and this is our first year, and we're really happy. Our family's really happy to be part of the community.
And I'm Michelle Crank. I also have a second grader. My son is in second grade. It's also our first year at Eaton. We're very happy to be there. I have a background in medicine. I'm a physician and trained at UT Southwestern in Dallas, Texas. I'm originally Texan, and then came up to the NIH to do my fellowship in allergy and immunology. So my specialty is immunology. Did research there for 10 years. The last 5 was in vaccinology, also working on respiratory virus vaccines, and did some work with mRNA vaccines similar to Moderna. The folks that made the Moderna vaccine were actually my old team. I left the NIH right before COVID and moved out into private practice. I'm actually at a private practice not too far away up at Friendship Heights for allergy and immunology. I do a lot of COVID testing. I wear a lot of N95 and KN95 and various other kinds of masks, and do a lot of consulting about vaccines for folks based around COVID. So happy to contribute whatever I can today.
Thank you, Michelle. And Allison, did you want to start sharing? Allison, please unmute when you can.
There we go. You can hear me now. Thank you. So one of the main points I wanted to emphasize tonight is I have heard a lot of chatter about wanting kids to wear N95 respirators, and so I just wanted to kind of go through a little bit of like what is an N95 respirator and should kids be wearing them. So I actually, the hospital was doing fit testing today for N95. So if you see this little TP, yellow TP hanging from the wall, this is what they use to test the fit of the N95 mask. So you put on the mask, so it looks like this, and then you go inside this contraption, and they spray some sort of scent or some sort of smoke. And the goal is to get the fit tight enough and proper enough so that you do not smell the scent or the smoke is not coming into your mask. And so that is what you need to do to have a properly fitted N95. And then on top of that, you need to do a negative and positive pressure seal test, which Michelle knows a little bit more about. I've only worn an N95 when I was pregnant and I was working with anesthesia which is a teratogen. And so I would wear it for an hour or two. And what happens after you wear these masks is I'm sure you've seen these pictures, but there's a lot of marks on the face. It's quite uncomfortable. And besides that, so I'm sure some of you have seen some KN95 masks that people are wearing where the ear loops, they have ear loops rather than the double elastic banding that a typical N95 has. The CDC kind of warns that upwards of 60% of these masks are counterfeit, and especially when they have the ear loops. They need to have this NIOSH stamp on them that stands for the National Institute for Institutional Safety and Health. If they don't have that, or if it's spelled incorrectly, that is a counterfeit mask. Moreover, there is no NIOSH approved respirators for children. And so right now, what the CDC is saying is that they do not recommend N95s or KN95s or something like this for children. I know that Omicron is more transmissible, but Michelle and I were talking earlier, and we kind of talked about the best kind of mask is a mask that a kid will wear. So the harder it is, the more suffocating it feels. The kid might pull their mask down more, and then any benefits go away. So that's kind of, I'm not giving medical advice. I just kind of wanted to frame the question and then give my personal experience with an N95.
Please, and Allison, you reminded me that anything that we talk about tonight is not being sanctioned or mandated by DCPS. This is just a parent chat, as well as this is not strict medical advice. That, of course, if you have questions about your children or your family, you should always consult your personal physicians. All right, Allison, thank you so much for that. Michelle, please.
And I didn't make slides. I just planned to chat a little bit, but the major things I would say about going back to school, Montgomery County, I guess, just has promised that they're going to give KN95s to every student, which is interesting considering that are not really regulated by US health authorities. So N95s, as Allison showed you a picture of, fit tightly to the face. They fit so that no air can come in around the nose or the mouth or under the chin. They cover the nose, they cover the chin, and they usually have two straps around the back of the head, and that's to make them fit properly. And when you're wearing them properly, you have one strap up high and one strap down low. You don't crisscross them. You don't do any jerry-rigging with the straps. And they basically suck onto your face tightly enough that if you inhale very deeply, you will not get a stream of air come in around the sides. And if you exhale, at least in a normal exhale, you won't get any air coming out and fogging glasses or other sorts of indicators that air is leaking. The N95s or KN95s are both made out of the same material. The material gives you the N95 number. It filters 95% of particles of a certain size through that filter material. But it means 0 if air gets in around the filter. So it filters 0 of what comes in around the edges. And so the biggest difference to me between an N95, KN95, a surgical mask, a cloth mask is, how well does it fit to your face first? And if a kiddo won't keep it on their face, it doesn't fit at all because they're going to pull it down, or it's going to slide down, or it's going to slide up, or they're going to put it on one ear, or whatever they're going to do. N95s, because they fit tightly, are uncomfortable. And being an MD who has a large supply of various sizes and shapes of masks, of course, I've tried to fit one on my 8-year-old, almost 8-year-old. It did not go well. He did not like it very much. He was, yanking at it. KN95s are looser. They're more comfortable, but because they're more comfortable, they don't have as tight of a seal. So that 95% of filtration may or may not apply, and it all depends on the shape of the face. When we got fit tested as clinicians to be around, back in the day, it was TB patients or flu patients. Those were the patients that we had to wear an N95 around. NIH made us come in once a year and sit in an office, and we didn't have the hood, but they had a device where they piped smoke into the room, and we had the mask on and a meter on the inside of the mask, and it read how many particles got through the mask. And they made us do all these maneuvers like talking, nodding, shaking our head, bending over, and some masks fit different faces differently. And that's on adults, all the same general size of a face. So the idea that you would fit test a 5-year-old and then have that mask still work for them when they're 6 or 7 or 8 maybe is not true. I had to switch masks at one point when I was pregnant because my cheeks got fuller and the original size of my cheeks didn't fit tightly enough to the original mask I fit tested in. And then I switched back after I had the baby, Thomas. And, so it's a variable thing. You have to actually actively test to make sure an N95 is really 95. Otherwise, it's not 95. No matter how good the material is, it can't filter if it's not capturing all the air. So the mask question is, again, I agree with Allison, what the kiddo will wear. And if you want to wear something like a KN95, just understand if it's loose, the 95 part doesn't mean a lot. And so it sounds good, but it may not be as good. If you have a surgical mask, which is the sort of paper masks, they come in multiple different shapes and sizes. There's some tweaks and tricks to get those to fit a bit better to the face. And you can also do things like put a cloth mask over top of a surgical mask to get the fit tighter against the face, because a cloth mask may actually hold it on and make more of a seal. So we've been talking a lot about masks because of Omicron, and because Omicron is a lot more contagious, and CDC, there are rumblings about CDC saying, oh, we're going to recommend KN95s and 95s for everyone. They haven't done that yet. But the news stories have sort of picked up on that. So that's sort of my spiel about masks. They should wear what they can wear. There are KN95s that are designed to fit smaller children. KN95s are out of China. They're not regulated by US. There are some reputable makers that CDC has outlined a list of, and you can find that online. And I can also maybe share a link of a website that lists some reputable KN95 makers. KN95s are fitted or sized to fit smaller faces, so you can find child-sized ones. But again, you have to try your kiddo in it to decide if they're going to be comfortable enough to wear it. And then there's a KN94, which is actually out of South Korea. And both of those masks, not really regulated by the US, but they are regulated by their own countries about how well they filter. And then N95s are not fitted for children. They're no small size N95s because they're designed to fit adults who are working in labs or who are working in hospitals. And so they just haven't made official, recognized, NIOSH approved N95s. If you've got a bigger kiddo who's a teenager, then you may be able to fit them pretty effectively in a regular N95, but it's going to be hard to do that with a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old.
Michelle, can I ask a question in terms
Of
of,
course.
you mentioned that when it comes to the surgical masks, which they give out free of charge at school, that you would recommend if someone was interested in doing a double mask, you would say you'd put that one on first and then a cloth mask on top and not the other way around.
You can do it that way. So the reason for that is the cloth mask you're assuming is fitting tighter. So the surgical masks sort of loop over the ears and they can have a gap on the sides and lots of air can come in. CDC says if you put a cloth mask over top, that will then hold the surgical mask better against the face and it may eliminate the gaps. And so that would be the order to do a cloth mask on top of a surgical mask. Now, that's not to say that that's true for other types of masking, double masking. And again, not sure double masking, maybe provides 10% better, 10% improvement in filtration. I think Allison has some information on that or look that up as well, about double mask versus single mask.
I would just say, again, like maybe it will provide a slight bump in protection, but if your kid is pulling it down more, then that's negated. And so, I think some other things I wanted to kind of touch on and maybe, like maybe put a positive spin on some of the data that's coming out, is there was just a report out of the New York State Department of Health, and this just came out January 7th. And so let's see. So right now, the hospitalization rate for vaccinated kids during the peak of Omicron during the surge is 2 to 3 per million. Hospitalization rate for unvaccinated kids is 1 per million. So it is double, but still very, very, very low. So I think, you know, in terms of the data that's being collected too, I think what we hear sometimes on the news is not always framed in a nuanced way. And so I just wanted to kind of emphasize that too, you know, when we're talking about all these mitigation measures, and just remind everyone that it does seem like, even though this is more transmissible, that kids are by and large doing okay.
And also there's data to say that the Omicron variant, part of why it's not so serious when you get the infection is it doesn't seem to attach as well to the lower airway human receptors as the Delta and the prior variants did. So it just doesn't seem to be impacting the lower airway as much. And if you think about low oxygen concentration and not being able to breathe and the reasons why people get hospitalized and why they go to the ICU or why they get intubated, it's because they can't exchange oxygen in their lower airways. So if the virus doesn't really get down there as well and doesn't infect and cause as much inflammation down there, that may make sense why people are catching it. You may not have great immunity even from your vaccine to avoid catching it in your nose, but it's not going to get down to the lower airway as well as Delta did, or as Alpha did, or as the original variant did. And so again, it's more benign course overall.
Is there a consensus on whether the vaccine protects against long COVID?
There's not a consensus that I know of. Allison, do you have any input on that?
So it's interesting because there's a study, and I can't remember when it came out. So I'd have to look into that further. But what I do remember is that they looked at the seroprevalence of people with antibodies, meaning that they had been infected with COVID. But before that, they surveyed them for reporting symptoms of what they would call long COVID. And there was actually a statistically insignificant difference between the two groups. So that being said, so A, long COVID fairly rare, and B, they couldn't really find a difference between a placebo. It wouldn't be a placebo effect, it would be the converse of that. But in any case, we know that the vaccine is at least reducing viral replication, reducing viral load. If it's reducing viral replication and viral load, it's going to reduce any adverse effects. So it will make for a more milder course and therefore less risk for long COVID.
And do you know the incidence of long COVID in children? Because I think that's what a lot of parents are concerned about. Is there an incidence of long COVID in children?
I will.
What I don't know is if there's an incidence of Omicron at all. That's what we don't know.
There's not enough data right
we
now.
don't, it hasn't been long enough, literally hasn't been long enough yet to know whether there's going to be the same kind of long COVID from Omicron as there was from Delta and the other more severe variants. There very well could be, and it's going to take months to know that. We do know that the S protein, which is the major one that had all the mutations with Omicron, changed enough that some of the PCR tests don't detect the S protein, that we're detecting it for all the other strains. We know that the vaccine S protein, which is the major protein in both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, is not matched to Omicron. Pfizer is releasing theoretically an Omicron specific booster dose as early as March, they project, which who knows how that'll go, but it's in trials starting shortly. it's probably going to be past the wave though. And that's always the problem with vaccines and pandemics, is you are often playing catch up because the virus is faster and smarter than the scientists can be, even with the fastest and the smartest, technology going after it. I see a question over in the chat. Given the antigen tests have shown high false negative rates, would it make sense to have some threshold around incident rate at Eden or some protocol for PCR tests? So that's probably a better question for Eden to answer than for us to answer. I will say this, across the board, antigen testing has false negative rates that are much higher in asymptomatic people. When they're used in symptomatic people, they're quite good. And so, if you're testing because a kiddo has a symptom, then I would say that's an okay test to use. And especially the more recently approved non-PCR antigen tests, they have gone through more stringent FDA oversight and been sort of analyzed even more deeply than the original batch that all came out, a year ago or 2 years ago now. And so the real recent ones, especially like, for example, the one that was passed around to all of us, the one that DCPS gave to everybody, has gone through that more stringent process. And so I believe it's a better test than the average one that would have come out a year ago at picking up, especially symptomatic. Some of them are good at asymptomatic, and a lot of it is oddly dependent on the swab and how it's done and how effective the swab is at collecting the sample. So if your kid doesn't agree with you that you're going to have the swab done and is fighting you and trying to escape you, you're going to not get a good answer out of any test. So similar to the masks, you've got to have that kid compliance along with the ability of the mask or the test to do its job at ideal circumstances.
What I'll also say is that, so my lab uses qPCR, quantitative PCR on a daily basis. And so it's very, very, very sensitive. And I think in the early days, we were actually trying to develop a PCR test for SARS-CoV-2. And we did, and it worked. And we basically tested it with a synthetic viral sequence to see if we could detect it. And we could detect very, very few viral particles, right? And so that isn't necessarily indicative of infectivity. So anecdotally, what's been said is that antigen tests are better at detecting when you are transmitting the virus, shedding the virus, because you're making a critical amount of it, versus the PCR tests, which could detect when you're not going to be infective, and then B, can detect dead RNA virus or dead RNA from the virus post-infection, if that makes sense.
Yeah, PCR tests can be too sensitive. In other words, they can pick up virus that's not going to cause disease, that's resolving from, an infection, whereas the antigen tests tend to pick up, more likely to pick up live virus. So I also see a comment about Eton staff or educators. We take guidance from DCPS and DC Health. And yes, sorry, that's me misspeaking. I shouldn't say Eton about anything. I should say this should come from DCPS guidance about when to escalate to PCR testing. Were there other questions about testing?
Well, there was the question that I forwarded to you that a parent sent in about advocating.
Oh, hold on. I have.
And while Allison's looking that up, if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah.
With so much Omicron going around, is there are you worried that the PCR test at DC Public School is going to be false positives based on past infection?
They're not doing PCR tests at DCPS.
Oh, so they're
Those
not
are
doing
antigen
PCR
tests.
tests? It's not
Antigen
PCR
tests.
test. So now it's an antigen tests on children.
for our return, safe return, those were antigen tests. So that.
But
like,
how about for the asymptomatic weekly testing? Is that going to be PCR or is that going to
Oh,
be?
that's a good question. That's a good question.
I believe that kids that have been infected with COVID are excluded for a period of time, like 3
You're
months
right, because
after.
I'm sorry, and I'm gonna
Mhm.
log off. They're telling me I gotta go home, so I gotta go.
Mhm.
But you're right, and so it's detected through a PCR, they say from 60 to 90 days. So our students who have been positive already will no longer participate in the asymptomatic test.
But the problem is there are going to be so many asymptomatic vaccinated children. And they may not even know that they have COVID. They could have had COVID 2 months ago, but then the PCR is could be a false positive.
So I'm not sure that PCRs stay positive across the board for 60 to 90 days. So in my practice, we actually have our own lab. We run PCR testing, we swab noses, and we especially have watched our own, staff or family members of staff over time, and we've tracked PCR results over time. And yes, there are a few people who stay positive for weeks, but the vast majority of people have a clear peak and then they come down. And much of CDC guidance is actually ignoring the PCR testing because they don't like to look at it because they think it's too sensitive and it picks it up long after the person is infectious. But actually, many people are down to 0 or undetectable by 2 weeks post their initial symptoms or post their initial positive PCR. I'm not sure that asymptomatic testing would continue to pick up for 3 months. An antigen. Now, antibody testing, if you were testing for antibodies, which is in the bloodstream, that's a blood test. That stays positive. Yes, absolutely. And that can be positive as a result of a vaccine or as the result of an infection. And that's there to be your memory. That's your response to the infection and the vaccine to protect you from another one. And that stays positive for months, absolutely, years even, depending on the virus or the vaccine.
Yeah, Miranda, to kind of piggyback on that, there is, like, for every test, there may be some false positives and false negatives. I saw some studies showing that there perhaps is like between a 0.5 and 1% false positive rate for the PCR test. And again, either that's because there's some contamination between samples or it's just a bit too sensitive.
I think this is really informative. And I appreciate you taking the time to help explain this to me because I've learned a lot. I was curious with the mayor's new announcement about any child younger than the vaccination limits getting a take-home COVID test every Friday at this point. I had heard that I think it might have been on one of Jackie's calls that the COVID tests are supposed to be taken in rapid succession, or I guess one and then a second 2 days later for the ones that we were given to go back to school. What is the accuracy level of doing it back to back like that versus just taking one rapid test?
Everything is test dependent. Yes, it's specific to the individual test. And so if that maker of the test that's being used by DCPS suggests that you take 2 tests 36 hours apart, it's because that schema, the way that they are prescribing it, picked up better sensitivity specificity than if you did just one test as a snapshot. And I'm sure,
but there's not a number associated with that, or they do disclose what the accuracy differences.
I don't know the answer to that. I would have to look it up with that test's manufacturer because they are all different. And if they've published it, we could find it, but I have not been able to look it up. And I'm sure my colleague could comment on that with her PCR experience and testing experience.
I mean, I would say that they probably say that because if you're asymptomatic, let's say you were exposed to COVID and you took a rapid antigen test, but maybe you didn't have a critical mass of viral particles so that you didn't pick up that piece of the virus that the antigen test is detecting. In 2 more days, you will if you were actually infected. So I think that is probably why they're making that recommendation. I don't think it's necessarily for for asymptomatic people who were not exposed, and you should just do 2 tests in rapid succession. I think it would be more for if you had an exposure.
Unfortunately, at this point, we have to sort of assume everyone's had an
Yeah.
exposure. Sorry, that's me.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but Allison, do you have that parent question?
Oh,
About-
yeah. So it said, sorry. It says, what are the additional policies we can advocate for with districts around testing to increase safety, such as the frequency and percent of asymptomatic testing, instituting tests to return after long weekends, et cetera. I mean, that's not up to us, you know, in terms of, but I guess what I would say is, from my perspective, again, there are, you know, and Michelle and I talked about this a bit, Eaton's already testing, or DCPS is testing 20% of kids every week. I think the CDC is recommending that you do 10% of the population every week. So they're already going above that. So, and if the kids are asymptomatic, kind of like the teleological question becomes, how many kids do you want to lock out of school, you know, if you include close contacts, by doing asymptomatic testing? You know, I just, in my mind, I just don't think it's necessary. I really think that this school is doing a great job. DCPS is doing a great job, and they're doing far more than a lot of cities. And I think that, you know, maybe instituting rapid antigen tests after a long weekend when people might travel, that might be a good thing. But, you know, I don't think we should increase the amount of asymptomatic testing. That's my
And the mayor
feeling.
last night, I don't know if many people have seen it, that they are instituting in the coming weeks the test to stay program that a lot of people were advocating for, as well as if school is closed for an entire week, we will do again that rapid antigen to be permitted to come back in on that first day back. That it was all announced last night. I'm sure we'll be getting more information about it as we in days to come.
Right. And Michelle, remind me, so the test to stay program is if you have an exposure and you're vaccinated, then you can just do a rapid antigen test. And if it's negative, you could continue to come to school unless that test turns positive. Is that right? As long as you don't
Right.
have symptoms?
As long as
Yeah.
as long as it doesn't turn positive. And I'm not clear on if you have to take it every day for a number of days.
I think you do.
Yeah,
I think that's what I
you take
heard,
it
but yeah.
for 5 or 7 days or so. But yes, yeah, that will kick up in the coming weeks. And we will of course get more information, and the HSA newsletter can push out more information as it comes, as we find out more.
I would also just add that there are other sources besides Eaton for testing in the district. Obviously, there are other places you can go to get either the rapid antigen tests or PCR testing, some of which are city provided and free, some of which are, you know, in CVS or other, you know, locations where you may pay for testing. And so if parents want to implement a more strict or stringent procedure for their own kiddo and test them once a week, that's totally fine, as long as they're then going to report that to Eaton staff and, you know, make use of whatever contact tracing comes of it if they get a positive. But yeah, I think DCPS and Eaton are doing a good job. And I think if you want to extend that, there are ways to extend it for your own family. I think we rely a bit on, you know, DCPS when it comes to coming back from breaks. And I agreed very much with testing everyone walking in the door after the winter holiday break. I think that was a thing, if nothing else, that was a way to be a net to catch anybody that had traveled and maybe was asymptomatic or maybe mildly symptomatic. I will say in my practice, I get a lot of people walking in my door saying, oh, my allergies are worse. And I say, I'm an allergist and there's no pollen out in December. So I'm not sure why your allergies are worse, but let's swab you for COVID. Oh, looks like, turns out you're positive for COVID, not your allergies. So, there are a lot of people that have very mild symptoms with Omicron, especially vaccinated folks. So, if there's a sniffle, swab it. That's what I would say.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, I just want to give a number here that I thought was promising. So between December 2020 and October 2021, overall, not age stratifying or anything, the death rate for vaccinated people is 0.00003%. And those largely were immunocompromised people, like people that were getting transplants, chemotherapy, et cetera. So, the vaccines, despite, some of what you may be hearing, there might be breakthrough cases, but the vaccine is doing its job, and it continues to do its job.
Yeah, if anybody has vaccine questions, I'd be happy to talk about that. So ask away.
We've got 10 more minutes. So if please feel free to unmute and ask Michelle and Allison.
Has Eaton thought about, so the pre-K4, some people are unvaccinated. Is Eaton like kind of segregating the pre-K4 class from the rest of the school?
Brenda, we would need Ms. Anderson here or Ms. Dance if you can answer, but Michelle and Allison are unable to answer a question like that.
But the answer to that
Okay,
question is no, we are not segregating the students in school. If those students actually have tested positive, our parents have been doing a really good job in terms of like keeping the students home. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Any further questions for Michelle and Allison? And Shalay, that's very kind of you to put in the chat that link to Mayor Bowser's update. Thank you for that. All right, well.
Oh, can I ask a question? Thank you so much. I found it just really insightful. I have a question, maybe not for you guys, but for the whole group, just around, Eaton's policies about double masking. So I've got a daughter in kindy who, that class has been asked to double mask. And, they're emerging each day double masked, and I've got a kid who's not loving it. I just wonder what everybody's, how we can kind of talk to the teachers about, not having this requirement for the kids. If anyone has any advice, I'm new to the school, so I guess I just want to throw it out there. And even if no one has anything right now, I guess I just, thought I'd put this out there.
Okay, well, this is Ms. Dance, the assistant principal. First, I just want to clarify, just turn my camera on. First, I just want to clarify, Eaton doesn't have a double masking policy. So what we have offered to the students, if they would like to wear a surgical mask, if they have recognized that their personal mask is maybe like falling off their face, we actually have given the classroom teachers additional masks that they could keep inside of the classroom in the event that that's occurring, or if their mask is wet, or if their mask has fell on the floor, the students actually can get a surgical mask. So Eaton doesn't have a policy in terms of double masking at all. And it is a preference. So if the students make a decision that they actually would like to do that, we also have not stopped them. So if there are teachers that are requiring the students to double mask, would be news to me, and I feel that I can speak confidently on behalf of Ms. Anderson as well. And this is some information that I can take back to Ms. Anderson.
I can confirm. I can confirm. My two kids came home today and told us that they were forced to put on the second mask.
Well,
yeah, I want to jump in and just say what my daughter told me was that it wasn't, it was heavily requested. So there is some anxiety that I've seen, you know, surrounding that. Maybe it's not like force, but it's, you know, in a power differential. You know, it's hard for little kids to refuse that if their teacher is asking.
Okay, well, I think that's fair, and thank you for bringing this to our attention. And it most definitely is something that I will take back to Ms. Anderson, and maybe for the younger students, maybe it does feel like, you know, it's something that they must do, but I most definitely can tell you that there are some older students in the 4th and 5th grade that have very strong opinions about double masking. And they also have shared different conversations that they actually have had with their parents as well. And they actually have declined the mask, and it hasn't been a problem. But for those individuals that have had this experience with your child's classroom teacher, you can privately just send me a direct message in the chat. So Ms. Anderson and I can address it.
Thank you for that, Ms. Dance.
You're welcome.
So our last 5 minutes, are there any further questions for Michelle and Allison?
Can I ask one question? And this is just sort of a best practices question. And thank you both, first of all, for doing this. This is super helpful and extremely informative. I was just curious what your opinions are in terms of best practices with so many people testing positive in families. I'm wondering if a family member tests positive, the guidance we've all heard is to isolate that family member. Obviously, that's hard if you have little kids. And so I assume it wouldn't work if you have a small child, obviously. But if you have older kids or if it's an adult, what are the best practices in terms of isolating family members who test positive and allowing other family members to continue with their normal activities if they're vaccinated? Thank you.
So a bit of, if it's okay, Allison, I'll speak first. A bit of the thoughts about vaccinated versus unvaccinated has gone out the window with Omicron, because we know that people can catch Omicron despite being vaccinated. Now that's catch it and have an infection in the upper airway, of course, not necessarily lower airway. I have seen people that were quote unquote fully vaccinated, well vaccinated, you know, had neutralizing antibody titers checked at 95%, you know, the week before and get Omicron. So, you know, the idea of unvaccinated versus vaccinated, I'm not sure I'm gonna have a hard line on that. But yes, we would say if it's feasible to isolate a positive case within the family, that means if they can have a separate bathroom and if they can have a separate bedroom, that's the basics, then yes, do that. Stick to that if you can. And there are families where only the one kiddo that was positive ended up being positive, and, you know, testing the whole circle of family members around him, it was negative for everybody else because they managed to get that kiddo isolated. Same with a parent, and it's easier with an adult, of course, to isolate because they can decide what they do and don't do. But, you know, if they can stay in their own bedroom, bathroom, that may work out to benefit the rest of the family. So again, unvaccinated especially should stay away from anybody who's positive, but even vaccinated, I think it makes sense to isolate if you can. But it's all if you can. If that's not feasible in your house, if that is not feasible in your apartment, if that is not feasible, you know, in the space that you have available, do what you can. You're trying not to spread it, and you're trying to keep everybody healthy. So take care of your kiddos. You know, certainly don't exile them to their bedroom by themselves and have no contact. If you need to snuggle your kiddo, go snuggle your kiddo.
So
And
I wanted to,
sorry.
oh, I just wanted to, just like a clarification point that is kind of a pet peeve of mine, and just like how the media reports. So there's a difference between SARS-CoV-2 positive and COVID. So SARS-CoV-2 is that you test positive for the virus. You might have no symptoms. COVID is the severe disease that is sometimes caused by SARS-CoV-2, right? And so I wish they would make that distinction more, because I think it would maybe help inform some of the decisions that we make. But for me, you know, my personal opinion, you know, in terms of the question that you asked is, if it was my daughter, I think she would be traumatized if I just put her in her room, you know, to isolate. So I would probably just make the choice to isolate our whole family, and kind of blow up our 10 days, and just make the best of it, because, you know, we're not living in a vacuum where only COVID exists. We also need to take care of the emotional well-being of our kids. And so that's something you should maybe consider also, if, you know, if there's a positive case in your family.
All right, we are just about at time. Allison and Michelle, do you have anything to add before we close out this evening? All right, that's thank you.
Just to say that if anybody has any more questions, you can feel free to contact me. I'm a room parent in second grade, and you guys can find me, I'm sure. Are you going to share info for any of us if we want to? I was going to send a set of links out for some of the references from what I talked about tonight, if that's okay.
What we'll do is that in Sunday's HSA newsletter, we'll send a link to tonight's meeting, and we will send all of your incredible links out as well.